There was no reference to this man, Muhammad. We can't find any reference to the city called Mecca. We can't find any manuscript for any book called the Quran. None of this we can find in the 7th century. But that's just silence. Where's the evidence? How do you prove evidence for something that never existed? Do you see the problem, folks? That was 1995. This is 2025, 30 years later. And everything I'm going to introduce tonight is based on evidence. We finally have the evidence.
Welcome to Events and History, where we explore the origins, teachings, and historical development of Islam with a fact-based, analytical approach. This is part 5 of the We Finally Have the Evidence series. If you haven't watched part 4, watch it here before you continue with part 5. If this is your first contact with the series, start with part 1 here. In this part 5, Dr. J. Smith compares the non-Muslim historical evidence for Muhammad to the non-Christian evidence for Jesus Christ, showing the inconsistencies in the 7th century Muhammad stories. With his trademark depth of research, Dr. Smith examines the sources behind both figures, exposing the late, fragmented, and often contradictory records surrounding Muhammad compared to the early well-documented evidence for Jesus. Let's watch the video.
That's just supposition 1. I've already got an hour and a half. I have half an hour to go to the next. Don't worry, they get much shorter. That's the hard stuff. That's the heavy stuff. That's the new material. Here's a second supposition. Muhammad has more historical support than Jesus. Do you believe that? This is what he says. I find it amazing that whereas Christians rightfully cite Josephus and Pliny and Tacitus as early proof of Christ's existence, in other words, the 1st and 2nd century, the non-Muslim references to Muhammad, which objectively speaking are even more compelling since they were written much closer to their subject's lifetime in the 9th and 10th century, are dismissed as irrelevant by those who would make him a figment of our imagination. He therefore claims that since Muhammad is far more historically supported than Jesus Christ, by denying his historicity, we are not only being inconsistent, but possibly dishonest. Abdul, he called me dishonest. You don't call me that. Of course, you're standing right there, you can't. So is Raymond correct? Is the historical support for Muhammad greater than that for Jesus Christ? Here's my response. Both Raymond and I agree that there are many very early 7th century, mostly non-Muslim and even Christian references to the word Muhammad. That's why I had to go through that with you, Kirk, at the very beginning. Notice I didn't say Muhammad. The first, only 2 years after he died. Whereas the first non-Christian references to Jesus do not appear until 60 years after he died. I'm willing to say that. But that's not Muhammad, that's Muhammad. Raymond gives only 4 examples. Actually, there's 15 he could give. He only gave 4, so I'm just going to deal with those 4 because of lack of time. He goes to the Doctrine Jacobi from 634, citing a dialogue in 634 where Justus describes what his brother Abraham writes to him regarding a deceiving prophet who had appeared amidst the Saracens, and Abraham recalling a conversation with a Jewish scribe who called that prophet a deceiver who comes with the swords and chariots. Isn't it getting confusing? Nonetheless, you have to read it so you understand what we're talking about. That's number 1. Number 2, he goes to the Thomas the Presbyterian 634, citing a battle between the Romans and the followers of Muhammad. Notice it's with the T, not with the D. And number 3, a Syriac flyleaf fragment from 636, which mentions Muhammad by name, he says. And this is what it says. Many villages were ravaged by the killing of Muhammad. Muhammad, not Muhammad. And the Coptic bishop, John of Nicaea, he puts it at 641, but actually it's written in 690s, refers to him as the detestable doctrine of the beast, that is Muhammad. No, not one of these references uses the name Muhammad. They all use Muhammad or Muhammad. Let's go through each one. The Doctrine Jacobi, a Greek Christian polemical tract written in Carthage. Now here's my problems. It mentions the Saracen prophet. It never mentions the name Muhammad or Muhammad anywhere. And it says that the Christ who was to come. Hold on a minute. Is Muhammad the Christ who is yet to come? No, that confronts chapter 33, verse 40. And that he assumes that Muhammad is alive in 634, but according to the traditions, he died in 632. He had the keys of paradise, which confronts the Islamic traditions. This prophet fits a Judeo-Christian monotheistic background. This Christ, this Christos in Greek, this Mashiach in Hebrew, who was to come, not Muhammad. He has the keys to paradise. That comes from Matthew 16, verse 19, referring to Peter's papal authority in the Catholic Church. And this Muhammad, or this Saracen prophet, who doesn't even have the name Muhammad, spoke Aramaic. I don't recall Muhammad ever speaking Aramaic. So, coming and going, there is no reference to the name Muhammad in this tract, no reference to the prophet being a Muslim or belonging to the religion of Islam, nor any reference to the city of Mecca, nor of his book, the Quran. He could be anybody. In fact, he sounds more like an Arab Christian brigand, employing the status of a prophet to gain for himself more credibility and authority. There's just nothing Islamic about this Saracen prophet. What about the Thomas of Presbyter, later revised in the 8th century, and refers to a battle between the Romans and the Tayyip of Muhammad. Notice Muhammad is the Pahlavi spelling, which means he has to come from Iraq if he's Pahlavi. That's how they spelt it up there. And that he would have come from our present-day Iraq, which is 1,200 miles to the north. He is a Tayyip. That's the Muhammad of the Tayyip, dominated by the Lakhmid region. You can see on the map where the Lakhmids are. They're way up in Mesopotamia, in Tajikistan in the 7th century. Note on the map where the red circle is where the Tayyip were located. Way too far to the north to be the Muhammad of the Hijaz of Central Arabia. He fights in Gaza, yet none of Muhammad's battles were in Gaza, nor anywhere near that far north. As before, he could be any Muhammad or any praised one, someone who is referred to as the praised one, an honorific title for the leader of the Tayyip way up in northern Iraq. And then you have the Syriac flyleaf, which refers to this battle in Yarmouk in 636. Notice where Yarmouk is. It's in what is today southern Syria. The Arabs of the Muhammad who have a battle with the Gabitha in Yarmouk. My problem is the battle is well documented, but note that it says Arabs. So who were the 7th century Arabs? Look at the map up there and you will see where that red rectangle is. They lived in today's Jordan and Syria, not in the Hijaz, so way too far to the north to be the Muhammad of Islam. The Arabs defeated the Byzantines at that battle, but according to the standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad died in 632. What was he doing in 636 in a battle? Could this be yet another of 7th century northern Muhammad, thus someone who is simply referring as an honorific praised one? And then he goes to the Coptic bishop Nikiu, and he writes this: embrace the religion of the Muslims, the enemy of God, and they accepted the detestable doctrines of the beast, that is Muhammad. Now, didn't I just get done telling you about 10 minutes ago that there is no one called Muslims in the 7th century? But look at the date, 690. What's he calling people Muslims and calling Muhammad with the vowels in place? What does that tell you? There were no vowels in the 7th century. The earliest manuscript of this is quoted in 1602 from an Ethiopic translation from the Arabic, which was from an earlier Greek translation, none of which exists today, suggesting once again that this is a later redaction back to the 7th century. So there was no reason why to use that, because it's way too late. This comes from the 17th century. It's a fraud. Now, what about Christians' historical record? Let's use the crucifixion, probably the most important event in the history of mankind. What does Islam do? What does this book do with the crucifixion? Well, in one verse, it shuts down the crucifixion. Has another man die in Jesus' place, puts him on the cross instead of Jesus, saying that there was no crucifixion. And in one verse, it just shut down everything we know about Jesus Christ. That's what the Quran does. Is that historical? No. Why don't we go back to the evidence from the 1st and 2nd century? Why don't we go back to Thales and Phlegon, these two Greeks, Samaritan historian and Roman writer, who were debating this event in 52 AD. That's 20 years after Christ's death. And in the debate, they mentioned that when Christ died, the earth shook and the sun went dark. Don't you think you'd rather trust them than the Quran that was written in the 7th and 8th century? I'd go to the 1st century, wouldn't you? What about Lucian the Greek satirist that refers to the death of Jesus Christ? Or Mara Bar Serapin, who has a letter to the pagan in 73 AD? Or what about the Jewish historian Josephus, who between 83 and 90 AD not only talks about the death of Jesus, but he mentions also the brother of Jesus, James' death, and he mentions that the Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Ooh, I love that. And then what are we going to do with Tacitus? A Roman historian who hated Christians, had nothing good to say about Christianity, yet he talked about the death of Jesus. He said that it happens during the time of Pontius Pilate under the rule of Tiberius. That's why we know it was in 33 AD, because of Tacitus. So I've given you Greek, Roman and Jewish historians from the 1st and 2nd century who all agree that it was Jesus who was on the cross. Yet even with just this example, we can see that Christianity has a far better record than Islam historically because of the outside hostile historical evidence. Now, what about the textual record we have? Remember I said earlier that we have the tafsir and the tahriq and the hadith and the sirah of Jesus, and we have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the writings of Paul. Remember I said that? Let's do a comparative. Now, I'm going to step on all your toes. You're not going to like what I'm going to do next, because you're not going to like the dates I did put there. I'm going to put the most liberal dates I can find. But I'm doing that for a purpose. Let's see when they were written down, and let's see how earlier they are. So when you talk about Jesus, we talk about the tahriq. That would be the histories of the early church written by Luke in the book of Acts, written between 52 and 62 AD. That's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. Paul's letters to the different churches, that's the tafsir of Jesus. That was written between 48 and 65 AD, within 15 to 34 years. You have the first sirah and the first hadith written by Mark in 70 AD, 37 years of Christ's death. Then you have the next two of Matthew and Luke written in 80 AD, that's 47 years after Christ's death. And finally you have the last sirah and the last hadith written by John in 90 AD, that's 57 years after Christ's death. Within 60 years, you have the entire New Testament. Within 60 years. Notice that all of these writers, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. And they either knew him personally or they got the material from others who saw what he did and heard what he said. So, comparing Christianity versus Islam. When was the earliest biography saying for the both faiths? When we look at Christianity, everything comes together within 60 years of Christ's death, written by those who either saw or heard what he did and heard what he said, or those who got it from the eyewitnesses. Whereas when you look at Islam, everything we know about Muhammad, what he said and he did, comes from 400 to 900 years later. Which would you guess is more authoritative? Are you listening to this, Abdul? Are you starting to get the idea? You've got a problem here, don't you? Yeah, no answer. Just put your thumb up. You're starting to come around. As a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus comparable to what the Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd to 5th century. How would we defend him? With statistics like these, how can Raymond suggest that Muhammad is much more historically supported than Jesus?
Apparently, Christians' writings about Jesus that make up the New Testament appeared between 20 to 60 years after Christ's death, whereas Muslim hadiths began to appear 400 to 900 years after Muhammad's death. The non-Muslim mentions of Muhammad in the 7th century are not reliable. One makes Muhammad seem like a Christian, while another makes him alive when he should have been dead. How can someone who is said to have died in 632 be seen in a battle in Iraq in 634? Moreover, Muhammad was said to have lived in Mecca and Medina, not Iraq. Anyways, let's watch Dr. J tackle the next supposition.
Supposition number 3. If Muhammad did not exist, how do we understand the Sunni Shiite divide? This is what he says. If Muhammad didn't exist, then no descendants existed either. So how can we understand the Sunni Shiite divide? Why would there be a huge contention involving the blood descendants of a man who had never existed? Now, to begin with, the first we even hear about Ali as Muhammad's choice is with Sahih Bukhari, volume 5. While the other counter-argument, which goes against that, exactly contradicts it, is also found in Sahih Bukhari, volume 5, book number 64, proving that his companions didn't even know what side they were on. Remember, the canonical version of Sahih Bukhari does not appear until the 14th to 15th century. So this is probably a much later story redacted back. But most importantly, this is a political dispute between Persians and Arabs, not theological. So it could have been created at any time by either the Abbasids or the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th century, and then redacted back first to al-Bukhari and then to the person of Muhammad himself in order to give authority to whichever position, Persian or Arab, you needed for that time and for your place. This is not surprising, as movements, both political and religious, often split, and the Sunni Shiite divide could easily have arisen for the same reason as the earlier Abbasid revolt, which at its very roots was due to disquiet over the earlier Umayyad dynasty. And here is another response. I'm not going to read through this. You can read through it when your own time, when you get the PowerPoint, by Dr. Pat Andrews. He just shows you, if you have that problem, what are you going to do with the King Arthur and Camelot legend? Did Camelot really exist? Was there a round table? Was there a stone with a sword in it that little King Arthur had to pull out? Well, Disney made that one up. And it's still being made up even today. Legends are exactly that. They get concocted, they get recreated, they get embellished, they get deleted and created century after century, depending on what your needs are. And that's exactly what we're finding with the Sunni Shiite divide. What about his reference to there are no incontrovertible proofs of Muhammad's non-existence? Boy, that's a mouthful. My response, I don't have to prove a thing here. The statement makes no sense to begin with. How can someone prove someone who did not exist? It is the person who claims that someone did exist who bears the burden of proof, not me. Okay? I turn that right back. Abdul, you're not supposed to agree with that. Don't say yes. Say, ooh, that's something I hadn't thought about. Raymond admits in his video that he hasn't even looked at our evidence. Why in the world is he confronting me if he's not even looked at my videos? That shows you right away that the fact that he hasn't even looked at our argument suggests that he is either naive or simply arrogant or is being typically Arabic with his one-upmanship style. I think it's the latter. The theories we have, Raymond believes, are only out there. The reason I'm doing this, he says, is because those of us who perpetuate them use us simply out of a dislike for Islam. Folks, he is correct. I do dislike Islam. But I absolutely love Muslims. Do you see the distinction I'm making? I want nothing to do with Islam, but I love Muslims. They are my favorite people. Why in the world have I spent 45 years working with them if I didn't love them? However, isn't Abraham just as guilty of disliking Islam? Which would invalidate his later arguments for Muhammad's existence based on the tradition. Be careful, that argument goes both ways. Are you seeing this, Abdul? Don't throw that at me, I'll throw it right back in your face. Supposition number 5. Since the traditions of Muhammad are so embarrassing, why in the world even write them? I love this one. This is what David Wood took me on about 2 years ago. We had a debate on this very subject. And he said, Jay, how can you have this guy? He is so embarrassing. Look at all the things he did wrong. Look at all the weaknesses he had. He was deceitful. He killed his enemies. He married a 7-year-old girl and consummated when she was 9 and he was 53. Ooh, that's just terrible. Look at this guy. He was demon-possessed. He tried to commit suicide. Goodness sakes, he started wearing female clothes like he was a transvestite. How can you invent somebody like that, Jay? Here's the problem. The difficulty is this. Raymond and David Wood, they are embarrassed by Muhammad because they are comparing him to Jesus. Therefore, they're looking at Muhammad through the grid of Christian cultural views. They're looking at Muhammad and they want him to be Jesus, but he will never be Jesus. No one can compare to Jesus. Of course, for us, he's absolutely embarrassing. But Muslims don't do that. They don't look at Muhammad through the grid of Jesus at all. Therefore, they love his virility. They love his violence and his denigration of others. In fact, Muslims, whenever I bring this up, they tell me this. Compared to Jesus, Muhammad is much greater. Jesus, he never married, he had no family, he never ruled, he never went to war, he never stood up against his oppressors, he never owned anything, he was a wimp. That's what they tell me. I want to follow Muhammad. He went to war, he had a wife, he had children, he controlled the whole country. He is his model that we use all over the Muslim world today, and he was a man, hoorah. Jesus was a woman. For a Muslim, they love Muhammad because of that. We hate him because he's not like Jesus. Be careful, folks. The more you show these things to Muslims, the more I agree with you. Absolutely. Why don't you come on home? He's a much better man than Jesus. What kind of model is Jesus? Didn't do anything that I want to do. What's more, if you're looking at his depression or his attempted suicide, his demon possession or his cross-dressing, even his homosexual tendencies, which Raymond loves to talk about, David Wood, they love to go on this. These are typical crises of every prophet. Every prophet goes through these crises. But they overcome every one of them. He didn't remain depressed. He didn't continue to wear dresses. He didn't commit suicide. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lived. Every prophet goes through them, and then they conquer them. And by conquering them, they prove and they show to us what we can do, proving that they were true prophets. And the same happened to Muhammad, a true prophet, because he surmounted these problems in their eyes. So be careful about using that argument, folks. Every time I use that argument, Muslims want to invite me to tea. Say, yes, thank you. Why don't you come back to Muhammad? What a guy. Hoorah, he's my man.
Dr. J was of the opinion that the Sunni versus Shia divide and the adopted son story could be a legend created by the Abbasids or the Ottomans and redacted to the prophet they created in their own image. And that could be true because legends are created in history, especially considering the 400 to 900 years gap before anything about the prophet is written down. Dr. J shut down the argument that the prophet's character is an embarrassment for a prophet, and no one could have created such a person. The fact that they love, adore, and defend these embarrassing characters of his shows that they actually created exactly what they want in the prophet. In a bid to have a religion that would unite their empire, they created a prophet in their own image. And we have seen what they created, a supermasculine, hypersexualized warlord, who could do anything to get whatever he wants and have whomever he wishes. The archetype of the alpha male bad boy character.